So we should restart. I think for the last part of our workshop, we have I have looked at the Wova app and noticed that we had a cumulative number of more than 100 participants over all day. And now we have the pleasure to have with us Leila Zia, which will have an interesting conversation with Olímpio Jorge. Olímpio, and Leila, the floor is now yours.
Okay, so maybe we should stop sharing this screen. How do you do that?
I should also add that after this conversation, we also have some times for attendees to participate in the discussion and do some questions to Leila.
So, Ricardo, can you stop the sharing of this?
I'm not sharing. So this is the Margarida. Are you there? This is the SEER host. Okay, she's okay. Thank you, Margarida.
Now we have. Okay, good. So, welcome back to the workshop after this very short break. I hope you had time to do whatever you needed to do. So it's a great pleasure to have here Leila Zia. Thank you, Leila, for being here. Leila is the head of research at the Wikimedia Foundation, the people who make knowledge free. So I like this slogan. A foundation that operates Wikipedia, Wikimedia and its history projects. Her research interests include quantifying and redressing the gaps of knowledge in Wikipedia and Wikidata, understanding Wikipedia's readers, and studying the contributor diversity projects. He's been a co-chair of WWW 2019, and she currently serves as the program committee co-chair of the Web Conference 2021, which used to be WWW. She had a PhD from Stanford University in management science and engineering. So thank you, Leila, once more. So the format of this keynote will be conversation, so kind of interview, but also we have here some questions for Leila, but of course it can go in different directions, so who knows. So I'll start with the first question, and since this is a narrative extraction workshop and we are working in NLP, clearly Wikipedia and Wikimedia swim in lots of text. What can natural language processing and in particular narrative extraction do for Wikimedia? So do you use NLP currently? What tools, what techniques or solutions do you use there?
Thank you so much for the invitation and a nice introduction. I'm really looking forward to this conversation and wave to you all attending remotely. I wish we could be in one place. I'll jump into the question by maybe giving you some context about how Wikipedia, how research and development in the Wikipedia space is being done. I would say Wikipedia and more broadly speaking, other Wikimedia projects. I'll give you the context first and then come back to answering the question. The context that I want you to know is that my answer is going to be incomplete, and that is okay. It is Wikipedia is part of a broader Wikimedia movement ecosystem, which is a highly distributed network of editors that you see the result of their work on the Wikimedia projects, but also volunteer developers, chapters, user groups, affiliates, and this network, because it's very highly distributed and the decisions are being made in a very highly distributed manner on this network, it is very hard for me to be able to say what exact NLP is being used across the network. What I can comment on are the things that are closer to what Wikimedia Foundation does as one of the entities that does research and development in this space, in this broad Wikimedia space, and puts basically code into production on for Wikipedia. So on that front, You can imagine some of the NLP kind of types of tasks being used and the research and development being done towards them on Wikipedia today. But I would say that not enough or not a lot, right? So the examples that I can tell you is Wikipedia is primarily today is giving back more to the NLP community than receiving back, and we can come back to what are the reasons for that. There are some examples that that's not the case. For example, in the search space, you can see that the information retrieval is definitely a space, like how you do search on Wikipedia, benefits from the NLP research, the work of the NLP research community, and of course can be improved also significantly. Another example that I can say from our own team is that we have done some research collaborations with Leibniz University in Hanover in Germany, and we have developed a neural network model that can detect which statements in a given Wikipedia article are in need of citation. So generally, editors make a choice whether the statement is common knowledge and doesn't need a citation on Wikipedia, or whether it needs a citation. This is done by humans today. And the question was, can we automatize this process, right? So we have developed a model, and that model is available today in English, Italian, and French Wikipedias, not all Wikipedia languages. And that model is being used by a bot that is developed by a volunteer developer. It's called Citation Hunt. So Citation Hunt uses the result of that model and tries to improve Wikipedia. Maybe another example that can be interesting for your community as an example of what doesn't immediately work, which I would expect to work in the Wikipedia ecosystem, is automatic translation. So automatic translation has improved significantly across the board over the past 15 years, or even more accelerated in the past 7 or 8 years. And we have a hard time within the Wikipedia ecosystem using the automatic translation technologies. Again, like I'll come back to this later. A lot of the technologies are being developed outside of an encyclopedic space. So the translation is potentially good for language pairs in a general context, but they're not really developed for the use case of Wikipedia, which is an encyclopedia with a particular encyclopedic language. And they also cannot really easily scale to all the different language pairs that we would like to see these systems scale to in Wikipedia. And of course, there's OCR, another branch of NLP that is being used as part of Wikisource, another Wikimedia project, to be able to bring more sources to be used in Wikipedia. I'll leave it at that with some of the examples that exist today.
Okay, thank you. I would like to also suggest to the audience, if you want to ask questions in Q&A, so you can write your questions, and we hope we have the chance to ask them to Leila as well. So please contribute with questions if you like as well. So next question is about summarization and visualization. So one of the things that we like here in this community is to grab texts and transform them into visual timelines and visual summaries. So do you envisage doing something like that in Wikipedia? Would that be useful?
Yeah, so I'll say this is not something that is being done automatically today in Wikipedia, as far as I know. Now, the fact that it's not being done, it doesn't mean it's not useful. Part of it means that we didn't have enough people who had interest in developing such technology for Wikipedia, right? And doing kind of the extra mile of testing with the readers and making sure actually this is useful for the particular Wikimedia languages or Wikipedia languages you're talking about. When I look at the data that we have, we know that depending on which Wikipedia language you're looking at, somewhere between 15 to 45% of the time, readers come to that Wikipedia language to read an overview or summary of an article. So generally, I would say text summarization is something that can be useful for these languages. Now, Wikipedia editors primarily consider the lead paragraph, which is the first paragraph in a given article, as the summary of the article. And one question I put out there for you and your community is, do you consider the lead paragraphs in Wikipedia articles as a summary of the article? Or the technology that you develop gives other leads to what should go in the lead paragraph of an article? And I would start from there and then look into what you can do with timelines. I would also say that Wikipedia is inherently open. So while a particular kind of technology and research representation may not end up on Wikipedia itself, you can have tools or technologies built on top of Wikipedia and Wikipedia data, and you can surface that technology. And I'd encourage you all to do that, because that's a fundamental reason that Wikipedia is open. The data is open, the technology is open, to allow you to do this and not be so constrained to just being on Wikipedia.
Thank you. So the next question is the opposite direction. So what can Wikimedia do for narrative extraction? So in particular, there are great approaches like wikification that the community is using, or entity linking, and what other resources do you have that can be useful for this community of narrative extraction from text?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what are all the different things you know about Wikipedia and Wikipedia data that is available. So I'll say some things which may be repetitive, but hopefully there are things that new for you and your community there. I'll say in terms of entity linking, it is important to not think about Wikipedia itself, but think about Wikidata as a language independent knowledge base that can basically capture the catalogs, the entity catalogs. I emphasize on Wikidata in this context because I think the language independence is important, and it also allows for the introduction of new entities that sometimes are more limited in the different Wikipedia languages. In terms of what Wikipedia or Wikimedia offers to your community, I will say it's a lot, right? If you compare with what is available from other platforms on the web or on the internet today, there are many choices and options that are available. Particularly, I would say data is something that is available. If you're working with Wikidata, data is under the CC0 public domain data licenses. And if you're working with Wikipedia, it's the CC by SA3. So you can access, for example, the XML dumps of every Wikimedia project, which includes all the content that is available on these projects, all the public content. If you go to dumps.wikimedia.org, MediaWiki APIs are another asset that can be useful for your community. So I encourage you to look into them if you have never looked at the APIs before. There are compute resources available. If you're doing research and development in specific areas that are going to benefit Wikimedia projects, then Wikimedia Foundation offers humble cloud service operations where you can have access to compute resources. And I encourage you to check out Wikimedia Cloud Services to see how you can use those resources, especially if you're coming from low resource environments and communities. There are research and software grants. I would say compared to what many of the R1 universities are used to, these are smaller grants. The whole of the grant can be 500K divided across many research and softwares, but these grants are available for researchers to, in lower resourced environments, to use the grants and do research and development for the purposes of improving Wikimedia projects. And I'll say last but not least, what Wikimedia and Wikipedia offers is a volunteer editor community, right? That is, and volunteer developer community that is dedicated and is empowered to make a change across the globe. So generally, I encourage researchers to get in touch with your local language community or local projects and be in touch with these editors, because these are some of the most dedicated people who exist on this planet that I know, that are kind of doing free knowledge for the world, right? And they're passionate to connect with other people and do good. So I generally encourage researchers to get in touch and be in touch with that community, because that's where a lot of the impact and change happens, at the community level.
Okay, thank you. So there's actually one question here from the audience that I will squeeze in, because it's related to this editors community and the editing articles. So this is from a researcher. It comes as anonymous participant. Sorry, there's no name. That works on generating Wikipedia-like articles for topics that don't have one yet. And apparently this researcher has been warned that uploading such articles violates editorial policies. And the question is, okay, do you have any suggestions on how would, oh, sorry, there's a problem here. Why would need to happen to work towards offering more automation on Wikipedia? So how could the community, researchers community, help in automating Wikipedia with these automatically generated articles, and what problems could arise from that?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I will say I'm going to assume that our anonymous participant has been working with English or one of the other big languages. If that's not the case, please just put it in the comments. So generally what can happen in these very large editor language communities is that they receive, the editors receive a lot of content every second. So on average, we're receiving around 4 edits per second in a language such as Wikipedia, right? So you can imagine that with this flow of information and knowledge coming into the projects and the patrolling burden that is on the editors are a little bit more careful about what kind of content they will allow to go on the projects. Generally speaking, what I've seen working well is when the performance of the model is high. What we as researchers may consider great work in terms of accuracy and performance of 95%, may not work with the Wikipedia standards, right? So 5% error can be too high of an error for a community that then needs to go and fix those errors. So I will say, if you want to put automatic generated content on Wikipedia, make sure that you have a solution to what happens to that percentage error that is going to happen. And you need to work that out with the community to see what is the solution. The other thing is that while it is exciting to put content on Wikipedia, I always encourage researchers to think long-term. And this is not something this is all our strengths, right, as researchers. So we are excited about research and development and kind of moving on to the next thing. And Wikipedia and the Wikipedia editors need to think about what's going to happen in the next 4 decades when we need to maintain this code and make sure that actually the code brings content on the projects that are useful. So I would say come from the place of empathy and try to acknowledge that there are maintenance challenges and try to address them. And sometimes this is easier to sort out if you work with the Wikipedia editors and the Wikimedia volunteer developers more closely to be able to address such questions. Maybe the last thing I will say in this context is there are particular projects that you can look at where a lot of the content is being developed automatically. So sub-project of Wikipedia, there are, within every Wikipedia language, there are different communities which label themselves as Wiki Project X and Y, right? So in the context of English Wikipedia, there's a Wiki Project group, which is called Wiki Project Gene Wiki Project. And this group is focused on writing articles on Wikipedia and bringing content from the gene and protein knowledge bases basically to Wikipedia. And what they have found over the years is that writing an article about a gene or a protein is something that you can more easily automatize. And they have actually worked this out with the English Wikipedia community. So they have a way of generating content automatically for these articles. So there are ways, but you need to kind of work it out with the community and figure out where are the areas that you introduce the machines, where are the areas that you're going to maintain the control by humans, and how are these two going to do the back and forth with each other in collaboration.
Okay, thank you. So just to clarify, the question was asked by Laura Dietz, and clarify that did you intend to ask it anonymously. So moving on to the next question about disinformation and bias. So this is a world full of disinformation, and we are dealing discussing bias news in social networks. So I guess that Wikipedia is also subject to that. So how do you handle this kind of phenomenon? Are there injections of fake news in Wikipedia? Do people try to take advantage of that? Is this solved organically? Do you use any automatic tools for this? How do you do it?
Yep. Very important question for Wikipedia and Wikimedia. I will say both on the bias front and also on the misinformation, disinformation front. I'll say a few things. One is, yes, there is bias on Wikipedia, and this is acknowledged, right? And this is expected in the sense that the biases that we have in our societies are being reflected on Wikipedia. What is amazing about Wikipedia is that it gives everyone a chance to change those biases, right? So I will say, as researchers, as humans in this world, I encourage each of you to help improve the biases that exist in Wikipedia today. In terms of misinformation and disinformation, yes, Wikipedia does get, it is a subject of disinformation and manipulation of content. This is again acknowledged by the Wikipedia editor community, so that I'm not breaking any news here to you all. And there are systems in place to protect kind of the integrity of knowledge that is on Wikipedia. And I will say we can't have enough technologies, at least for the coming 10 years, to support the Wikipedia editors and patrollers in the work that they're doing. A lot of their work is manually done. Before I go to that part, I will say a little bit about how Wikipedia operates and generally how does it handle disinformation or any kind of patrolling today, patrolling of content. So generally speaking, Wikipedia works based on the assumption that if you give people the chance to do the right thing, the majority of the people will decide to do the right thing. So if you show an edit button to people and you let even readers without logging in to edit, the majority of the people will do the right thing, which is improving the content and making the knowledge better. And this has proven to work over the past 20 years, amazingly. Of course, Wikipedia is not naive, right? So Wikipedia understands that there can be, and Wikipedia editors understand that there can be manipulation of content, there can be mistakes that are done by the editors. So transparency is a big part of what Wikipedia does and is about. Every Wikipedia article page is accompanied by a history page which tells you who exactly at what time has done what edit on Wikipedia. And if you don't agree with that edit, if you think that's not a good edit, you can go and revert it, you can go and improve it, right? There are also policies, content policies that are built in place, such as verifiability of content, which requires content that is not common sense to be backed up by reliable secondary sources, or the no forking policy, which forces editors to agree on how content is going to be represented on Wikipedia, as opposed to having different forks of of the same topic, or Wikipedia consensus, which enforces the policy that the editorial decision making is consensus based. These are all kind of different levers that the editors use to try to assure that everyone comes to one place and talk and discuss and understand like what needs to go to a Wikipedia article. All of this being done, the quality of the implementation of these policies is a function of many things: availability of the editors and patrollers, the severity of the attack on Wikipedia, how the availability changes across the different languages, how many editors you have, how many patrollers you have. This is a challenge. It exists. Now, what machine learning or artificial intelligence or your community particularly can do in this space, I will say I don't have all the answers of what you can exactly do, but I can tell you some of the things that we have seen starting to work. Our team in Wikimedia, in the research at the Wikimedia Foundation, is investing, for example, on aligning statements across the Wikipedia languages. And that's with an effort to try to understand if certain type of content is being represented in certain ways in certain languages, and whether that differs from other types of languages, right? And that can be maybe a flag to start signaling to the patrollers that something may be wrong in a given language, right? Or you can think about another line of work, which is around what's called sock puppet detection. The sock puppets are accounts that are operated by the same individual. They can be benign or they can be malicious. And our goal is to be able to help patrollers identify sock puppet accounts more effectively, because sometimes they go into networks and they do organized activity on the projects, and they're very hard to tell, because generally the assumption is good faith and that everybody is doing the right thing on Wikipedia. When it comes to story generation and text summarization, I would encourage you to be creative. So you can think about kind of summarizing text across the different languages and the different Wikipedia articles and start comparing them with each other to try to understand, are we seeing the same summaries? And if we don't see the same summaries, is that a source of misinformation potentially, or is that a source of bias? How can we help bigger languages with content from smaller languages and vice versa? And I will say something that is of concern for many Wikipedia editor communities is the issue of language imperialism. And I'll emphasize this because a lot of the research that we see within the research community is focused on English Wikipedia. Or when we go outside of English Wikipedia, we go to a couple of other bigger languages, such as Spanish Wikipedia, German Wikipedia. And we would like to break this cycle. It is amazing to do research on English Wikipedia. Of course, it's understandable. It's one of the most widely read and edited Wikipedia languages. But also, I would say as researchers and as developers, we have responsibility for breaking this cycle. So I encourage you all, especially if you are multilingual speakers, to look at your language communities and look at what you can do in your particular language when you think about the issue of bias.
Thank you. So there's here one question by Adam Yakov that I will take the liberty to generalize. So Adam is specifically asking about detecting obsolete content on Wikipedia, and if there is any data set that could be used for that. And I would like to add to Adam's question, if he allows me. Well, I will not wait for his permission. That you mentioned that editors can reverse some edits, and this can also be added by consensus. So this would also be great data sets for the community. So what editors labeled as wrong or biased or whatever. So this kind of data sets with obsolete content or biased content, do you release them, or would you release them?
Yeah, these are great questions. I will start from the second one and I'll go to the first one then. I would say there is an amazing opportunity to use what the Wikipedia editors are already doing on the projects and use those as labels for data sets. Wikipedia editors by design are very particular. They pay attention to a lot of details, and over the years, they have developed all sorts of technologies to help them do the work that they think is important to do on the projects. There are many templates, for example, that are being used by Wikipedia editors to label content quality or content reliability issues. I encourage you to search for wiki reliability, Wikimedia research on a search engine of your choice, and check out a recent data set that Diego Saez and Miriam Reddy with an intern from our team have released on this topic. So they have looked at English Wikipedia, the maintenance templates that exist on the English Wikipedia, and how these are being used by editors. And they have developed this data set of positive and negative cases of the existence of these templates as a signal for reliability of content or lack of reliability of content in specific areas. So check those out. And yes, generally, I encourage looking at these maintenance templates. To the first question, what I heard was also maybe an implicit question that the templates may be old, and that can be the case. So for example, you may see a citation needed template in a given Wikipedia article while the citation issue has been fixed. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for both identifying missing templates in given languages or in different Wikipedia articles, but also having technology to help editors update. Raise a flag and say, this template may have to be removed. I would say if you embark on that path, it is really important to work with the particular wiki project and community that is interested in this, because usually editors are overwhelmed with the amount of work. So if you come with, these are another 10,000 flags that you have to review, the reaction may not be very positive. But if you work with the wiki projects, they will help you find ways, and wiki reliability on English Wikipedia, for example, is one of the projects that is active in this space. You can find ways to basically surface the technology that you would like to develop and support the editors with.
Okay, thank you. So another question here by Sergio Nunes, which is related to the data issue, is if you could detail the relation between Wikipedia and Wikidata, which one should be considered the ground truth?
That's a hard question. So I will say at this moment, so generally the idea is that Wikidata is going to work as a knowledge base behind Wikipedia, and beyond, right? So you will have the type of content that you may never see on Wikipedia in Wikidata, but not vice versa. So this being said, Wikidata is not fully there yet, right? So there's a lot of missing content in this knowledge base today. So I would encourage, depending on the application, to both look at Wikipedia and Wikidata and try to use the information that is available to both of them.
Okay. So you mentioned the language issue and the language diversity problem that is one of your concerns. So I don't know if you already have, if you have said everything about this that you wanted to say, but how do you promote language diversity, and how do you fight this on the field?
Yeah, so I won't claim that my thoughts are very organized on the topic of language diversity. I will say I haven't said everything that I wanted to say. It's an important topic for us. And for me personally, some of you may know I come from the Persian Wikipedia, the Farsi language, and for me, it is one of the more kind of low resource languages that exist in Wikipedia today. I'll say the most important component for us as we think about having content in a Wikipedia language or in Wikipedia at all is to think first about the community of people who are going to come together to write this content. So I will say Wikipedia to me is a place of knowledge, and knowledge is not independent of people. So part of the knowledge is content, but part of it is also about who gets the seat at the table to help develop that knowledge and who helps to bring that knowledge to the world. The choices that we make in terms of what knowledge we bring to the world, these are all important choices. So to me, Wikipedia is not just about the content. It's about empowering people in different cultures, languages to come together and contribute to the knowledge of the world. And when I come from that view, I see a lot of things missing in Wikipedia today, right? With the amazing work that the editors have done, there are, even within the English Wikipedia, you can see the differences in terms of the length of content that exists across the different articles, or kind of the depth that is available, the number of references, the quality of the content that is available. And as you go outside of English as a language, you see major differences, right? One effort that I think is really important, I said earlier, and I'll emphasize, is that as researchers, we have a lot of power in terms of what is going to happen to Wikipedia across the different languages. So I encourage each of you to think about the different languages and how you're going to include them in your research. The other thing I want to say is that Wikimedia Foundation has started investing in this project called Abstract Wikipedia. The project is in its early days, but the idea is, at the speed that the content and knowledge is being generated today, Wikipedia is going to lag a lot. And by lagging, we're basically keeping content away from people who need that content right now. So you have languages with 80 million, 100 million speakers today, which don't have Wikipedia articles in essential topics, right? So if you're speaking Malagasy, and you don't have a well-written article on climate change, that is going to be an issue, right? So there are critical places where we need to accelerate content creation and the maintenance of the content. So abstract Wikipedia is kind of a conceptual extension of Wikidata. The idea here is that we're going to have one content per article, and then we're going to have renderers per language, and then these renderers are being developed and maintained by perhaps a new Wikimedia developer community, Wikimedia research community, and these a combination of a content that is available language agnostic, the renderers, and the constructs is going to help us bring Wikipedia to more languages. You're never going to receive a Wikipedia article via this system, or we don't think you will see a system where the content is going to be available at the kind of human level that you see in some of the articles on the English Wikipedia today. But I expect abstract Wikipedia to embark us on a lot of natural language generation type of research, and also availability of content down the line in more languages. I'll encourage you to check it out. If you search for abstract Wikipedia in your search engine of your choice, you can read more about the project, and it can be interesting for your community.
Okay, thank you. So we are approaching the end of our slot. And you already mentioned some future challenges, which was the question I had here to the end. So what are the future challenges? And one of the things you already mentioned, and actually Adam Yatov also asked a question related to that. I will read Adam's question. Some of the articles may not be very comprehensible for average readers. For example, content in specialized domains like physics or law. The Wikipedia project is, however, very small. Are there any works on the side of Wikimedia for making articles, or at least their abstracts, easier to understand? I think you already mentioned that, but that would be great to hear you about.
Yeah, I'll be brief here. One is to say, on English, there is a project which is called Simple English Wikipedia. You may want to check that. And the idea there, and I wish simple exists for every language, is that what if you don't know all the terminology, which is different than the concepts. But the idea there is, let's simplify things for people to understand the content better. Within Wikipedia itself, there's a wiki project called Wiki Project Medicine. And they have been pushing really hard within the Wikipedia editor community to say the lead or first paragraph of articles related to medical content needs to be understandable by people who may not have any background in medicine. So if you read it, you don't want to see like fancy codes, anything. I'm a patient, I'm seeking information. I want to be able to read that article, right? So there are like pushes in specific areas on Wikipedia. I will say from my perspective, it is critical to have different levels of complexity on Wikipedia. As you mentioned, some of the physics articles are the famous ones. Even with a PhD, you may have a hard time understanding what's happening in that article, which speaks to the sophistication of the editors who write that article, but also not tuning that article to the different audiences of that article. So I encourage generally research and exploration in that space to understand how can we have maybe a nudge that can help us understand the complexity of the articles and surface the articles in certain sequences with certain levels of complexity to the readers.
Okay, so another question from Herman Kohl. Have you any good hints on how to practically work with Wikidata? For example, the query endpoint often runs into timeouts if queries are getting more complex. Downloading and parsing the Wikidata dump is obviously often problematic too. My experiences are that I have to work with smaller subsets of Wikidata.
Yes, and I will say requests for improving Sparkle can be something that can encourage more investment in that space. However, I understand this is not resourced enough. So I will say raising awareness about your need for better service on the Sparkle front can be one solution. The other one would be basically taking the data out and processing it out which I know is not very accessible. As I'm saying this, I know that we're basically limiting the number of people who can use the data. This is understood as a problem. It is the priority of investment in this space, I think, is something that is not favorable or has not been favorable in the past couple of years.
Okay, thank you. So the last question I would say here, at least the one that the last that was put here by Laura Ditz. So Laura is asking, or is she's coming back to the question about different depths in the article. So when different cultures want to discuss the same topics differently, I could imagine a more in-depth discussion on pasta in Italian Wikipedia and a deeper discussion on sauerkraut in German, which would not be discussed the same way in English cultures.
And is the question how to address this, or?
So the question is if it makes sense to have different different views on the same articles in different language according to the culture.
Yes. This is a hard one. I will tell you my personal view. This is not necessarily the view of Wikimedia Foundation or Wikimedia editors. I think there are certain topics for which it is desirable to have different representation of content and the way the story is being told across the different languages. Pasta can be one example, the kebab can be another example, like for Iranians and Persians. I would say there are other types of topics that are trickier to allow to go across the different languages. And we see the challenges of that happening in some of the languages. So for example, on topics of historical importance, where nations have divided in the past, the question of what is the true version of the article is a hot topic, right? So if you're talking about Holocaust, for example, what kind of topic and how you want that content to be represented across a different language is not answered today, right? So we are leaving that to the different language communities to make a decision about how they want to represent that content. And it's not clear to me that that is the final place we should be, because we are seeing divergences in historical topics and divergent topics that can be unhealthy for Wikipedia and for the broader reader base that reads Wikipedia.
Okay, so thank you, Leila. I will just ask you if you would like to add some words without any question, anything that is pressing you to be said now, so that we can close our session.
Before, if I can do a question to Leila. So Leila, during our meetings, we have discussed the fact that editors or contributors of Wikipedia may be in the future replaced by algorithms that automatically create the articles, which may be kind of interesting. Consider that contributors on Wikipedia follow Zipf's law, with a few contributing a lot. From your personal view, again, from your personal perspective, do you find it risky to have this possibility of replacing editors, or instead appealing as a means to automatically enlarge the Wikipedia corpus over different languages, or even probably a mid-term in between the
yeah. So yeah, this is a great question, and my personal view is that we should not advocate for the replacement of humans by machines. I think what we should advocate heavily for is to understand what the human is trying to achieve on Wikipedia and assist the human, the editor in this case, for doing that job in a more efficient or effective way if they choose to, right? This is a volunteer effort, and people come with different motivations for doing that volunteer work. And the replacement of machines can take away a lot of that joy and motivation from people. And I honestly do not see the machines to be ready to replace, right? So the quality of content that we see, with the attention to details that we see editors of Wikipedia give when write content, is not something I can see machines easily replace in the near future. And by near, I mean the next 15 years, 20 years. So what I'm excited about is that collaboration between human and machine the transparency of the machine, for the human to be able to understand what is happening exactly and what's happening on the projects. I think this is particularly important because to me, Wikipedia is not about content only. It's about the human involvement, because knowledge is not just about content, about this process of you and I talking, disagreeing, agreeing, and kind of trying to shape knowledge. I think this is kind of I can use this as a segue to answer Alipio's last question, to say, to me, one of the most important messages that I would want to leave you all as a community with is that what you do matters. What you do for Wikipedia and other Wikimedia projects matters. And my ask to you is, when you develop technologies, consider to open source that technology, and also consider to publicly, under a free license, open the data that you work with. One of the biggest challenges that we have is that all the fancy technologies that are being developed are proprietary. We can't use them on Wikimedia. We can't use them in our production services because of our commitment to open source, which has good reasons, right? So contribute back to the open ecosystem. And I will say, think from the early on how you're going to do it, because it's, once you develop your research and at the end you think, oh, how am I going to make this open source? You're going to run into a lot of difficulties because there are a lot of components that you have likely used which have not been open. So consider that. Keep an eye on Abstract Wikipedia. I think it's a project with a lot of promises for your community and things that you may be excited about. And I'll say, if you're interested in Wikimedia and Wikimedia research, Wiki Workshop is going to happen on April 14 as part of the web conference. You can go to wikiworkshop.org and get in touch with us. I think that will give you some more chance to interact with the Wikimedia research community more closely.
Okay, thank you. So any other question? Any other question from the panel or the participants? So the Q&A is not growing now. So I guess we can close. Thank you, Leila, so much for the great talk and the information that you've shared with us. And thank you to Wikimedia for the huge service that you are doing to the world. So it's definitely something that we all use, and we almost feel that it's there since ever, and it's just there. And there's a lot of people working on it and making it happen. It's like magic. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. Good luck.
Leila,
thank you. Thank you so much.
Honor to have you here.